Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. It's called Anti-Oppressive Practice, or AOP for short. We got some great source material that was sent in, some excerpts from an academic paper all about AOP, and a lesson plan from Algonquin College. And it looks like you're really trying to wrap your head around this stuff. So we're going to unpack what it's all about, how it works, and some of the things to look out for. Ready to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. AOP can seem a little bit complicated at first, but it's really all about understanding how power and inequality kind of affect people's lives.
So,
Yeah.
I guess it's not just about being nice to each other, right? There's more to it.
Right, yeah. It really goes beyond just individual actions and looks at those systems and structures that can kind of lead to oppression, like trying to understand why some people have a way harder time getting ahead in life, even if they're working just as hard as everyone else.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does AOP actually address these bigger issues then?
Well, AOP uses all these different ideas from different fields of study that can help us understand how power and inequality work. It's kind of like using different tools to fix a problem, right? You might need a hammer, a screwdriver, or a wrench to get the job done. AOP is kind of like that toolkit for understanding and addressing oppression.
I like that. I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah.
So what are some of those key tools in this AOP toolkit that we're talking about?
Well, one of the most important is this idea of critical consciousness. It's about recognizing that all of us have these biases and assumptions that are based on our own personal experiences, and those can sometimes get in the way of understanding other people's perspectives.
So it's kind of like checking your blind spots when you're driving, I guess.
Yeah.
You might not see everything around you unless you're really making an effort to look.
Exactly. Developing critical consciousness is all about being aware of our own blind spots and how those blind spots might affect how we interact with other people. And this isn't just for social workers or anything. This is something that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so how do we actually put this into practice? Does AOP give us like guidelines or something?
Yeah, it does. AOP is built on 5 key principles that help us understand how to work towards a more just and equitable world.
Okay, 5 principles. What's the first one?
So the first one is critical reflection on self in practice. And this basically means that even with the best intentions, social workers or anyone in a position of power really need to be aware of their own biases and how their background might be influencing their actions.
So even if you're trying to help someone, you could accidentally make things worse if you're not being super careful.
Yeah, that's right. Let's say you're a social worker meeting with someone who's struggling financially. Even if you come from a similar background, the fact that you're in a position of authority can create this power imbalance. You have to be mindful of that and make sure you're not imposing your own values or judgments onto that person.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. It seems like this could apply to all sorts of relationships, not just social work.
Absolutely. It's about understanding power dynamics in any interaction.
Okay, so we got critical reflection on self. What's the next principle in this AOP toolkit?
The second principle is critical assessment of service users' experiences of oppression. Basically, it means going beyond just listening to someone's story and really trying to understand how different forms of oppression might be impacting their life.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down a bit. What do you mean by different forms of oppression?
Okay, well, think about it this way. We all have these different identities, right? Gender, race, class, sexual orientation, ability, all that. And sometimes these identities can lead to people being treated unfairly or facing disadvantages in society.
Right. Like if you're a woman and you're paid less than a man for doing the same job, that's not fair.
Exactly. And sometimes all these different forms of oppression, they can overlap. For example, a woman of color might face discrimination based on both her gender and her race. That's what we call intersectionality.
Intersectionality. Got it. So this principle is about really taking the time to understand how all these different factors might be shaping someone's experience.
Yes, it's about seeing the whole person and understanding how their unique identity might be contributing to the challenges that they're facing.
Makes sense.
Okay.
On to principle number 3.
All right, number 3 is empowering service users. This one is all about shifting the power dynamic and recognizing that the person you're working with has the strength and the capacity to make changes in their own life.
I like that. It's like giving people the tools and support they need to kind of take control of their own situation.
Exactly. It's about moving away from this model where the social worker is the expert who comes in and fixes everything, and instead recognizing that the person seeking help is the expert on their own life.
So it's more about collaboration then
Yeah.
than just telling someone what to do.
Right. It's about working together to figure out what solutions are going to work best for them. And a key part of that is understanding how those systems and structures are contributing to people's struggles. We call that externalizing structural oppression.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So let's say someone's struggling to find affordable housing. Instead of just focusing on their individual choices, we might want to look at the bigger picture, right? Are there enough affordable housing options in their area? Are wages keeping up with the cost of living? By understanding those broader factors, we can start to challenge the systems that are creating these problems.
So instead of blaming the individual, you're kind of looking at the context that they're in. That makes sense. What's the fourth principle?
All right, the fourth principle is working in partnership. And this one really builds on the idea of empowerment and emphasizes the importance of collaboration and shared decision-making.
So it's not just about giving people a voice. It's about actually listening to them and taking their input seriously.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the person seeking help is an equal partner in the whole process. They have valuable knowledge and insights that can inform the best course of action.
I can see how that would be really empowering for people. Okay, we got one more principle to go. What is it?
The fifth and final principle is minimal intervention. This one can seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it's all about respecting people's autonomy and avoiding unnecessary intrusion into their lives.
So even though you're trying to help, you also want to be careful not to overstep.
Right. The idea is to intervene in a way that minimizes disruption and empowers people to make their own choices. Sometimes that might mean providing support and resources so that they can navigate challenges on their own.
So it's about finding that balance between providing support
Yeah.
and respecting people's independence.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that people are capable of making their own decisions and shouldn't be treated as if they're helpless.
I'm really starting to see how these principles all kind of connect with each other. It's like a whole new way of thinking about how we interact with each other and with the world around us.
It really is. And it's not just about social work either. These principles can apply to our personal relationships, to our work environments, and even our involvement in social movements.
Yeah, that's a good point, it seems like.
Yeah.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. We've covered a lot of ground already. But I have a feeling there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's what we're going to dive into next time.
Can't wait. We'll be back to unpack some of the complexities and limitations of AOP and see how all these principles play out in real-world situations.
Welcome back. Great to continue this deep dive with you.
I'm ready for more. We covered those 5 core principles last time, and honestly, it's a lot to take in. I've been thinking about them ever since.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift in perspective for a lot of people. And like with anything, putting these principles into practice can be tricky.
That's actually what I wanted to ask about. You mentioned earlier that AOP can sometimes feel a bit too theoretical. So how do we bridge that gap between understanding these principles and actually using them in real life?
That's a great question. And it kind of brings us back to that idea of reflexivity, that ongoing self-reflection we were talking about. It's not enough to just know the principles. We got to constantly check ourselves and make sure that our actions are actually lining up with our values.
So it's like walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. We all have blind spots, right? And sometimes we might unintentionally say or do things that reinforce oppressive systems, even when we're trying to be helpful. Reflexivity helps us catch those moments and course correct.
It sounds like it takes a lot of humility to admit when you're wrong.
Yeah.
Or when you haven't fully considered someone else's perspective.
Yeah, it definitely does. But that willingness to learn and grow is so essential for being an effective ally and advocate. It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers and being open to feedback from other people, especially those who have experienced oppression firsthand.
You know, we were talking earlier about how AOP can apply to all sorts of relationships, not just social work. Can you give me an example of how this reflexivity might play out in a more like everyday situation?
Sure. Imagine you're having a conversation with a friend and they share something that's going on in their life. Maybe they're feeling really stressed out about their job and they make a comment that feels a little insensitive or judgmental towards another group of people.
Okay, yeah. I can see that happening. We all slip up sometimes.
Right. So instead of just letting it slide or agreeing with them, you could gently challenge their perspective. You could say something like, hey, I know you're stressed, but I'm not sure that's really a fair characterization of that group of people. Have you considered it from their point of view?
Right. That's a good approach. It doesn't shut down the conversation, but it opens up a space for reflection. And potentially learn something new.
Exactly. And it models that willingness to engage in critical self-reflection, which it can be kind of contagious in a positive way.
For sure. It seems like being able to have these kinds of conversations is crucial for creating a more just and equitable world. But I'm also wondering about the bigger picture. We've talked a lot about individual actions, but what about systemic change? Where does AOP fit into all that?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the realm of social movements. AOP is really deeply intertwined with the goals and strategies of movements that are seeking to challenge oppressive systems and create social change.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give me some concrete examples of how AOP principles show up in social movements?
Yeah, so think about the civil rights movement in the United States. One of the key principles of that movement was nonviolent resistance, which aligns really well with that AOP principle of minimal intervention. Instead of resorting to violence, activists use peaceful protests and civil disobedience to disrupt oppressive systems and force those in power to listen to their demands.
That's a really powerful example. It shows how AOP isn't just about individual actions. It can also be like a blueprint for collective action and social change.
Exactly. And another great example is the disability rights movement. This movement's been super successful in advocating for accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I can definitely see the connection to AOP there. It's about recognizing the rights and dignity of all people, regardless of their abilities.
Right. And the disability rights movement's been really effective in using that AOP principle of working in partnership to achieve its goals. Activists have worked alongside policymakers, educators, and community leaders to create more inclusive spaces and challenge those discriminatory practices.
It sounds like AOP provides this framework for understanding how these movements operate and how they can be successful in creating lasting change. Are there other examples of how AOP shows up in movements today?
Oh, yeah, tons. Think about the movement for Black Lives Matter. This has been so powerful in raising awareness about systemic racism and police brutality.
Absolutely. It's been so important in challenging those systems of oppression.
Yeah, and a lot of the work that's being done within the Black Lives Matter movement aligns really well with AOP principles. For example, there's a really strong emphasis on centering the voices and experiences of Black people, which is a core element of that AOP principle of empowering service users.
That makes sense. It's about amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized.
Yeah.
And allowing them to lead the way in creating change.
Exactly. And there's also a huge focus on challenging those traditional power dynamics between law enforcement and communities of color. Activists are demanding accountability and transparency from those in positions of power, which aligns with that AOP principle of critical reflection on self in practice.
It sounds like AOP provides a really powerful framework for understanding and enacting social change. It's not just about some abstract theory. It's about putting those principles into action in a way that can actually make a difference.
It really is. And it's something that we can all be a part of, whether we're working in social work, participating in social movements, or simply trying to be more mindful and equitable in our everyday interactions.
This has been so insightful. I'm already starting to see the world in a new light. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. This idea that AOP can sometimes be criticized for being too focused on the big picture and not offering enough concrete solutions.
Right. That's a really valid critique, and I think that's where the concept of praxis comes in.
Okay. So it's about bridging that gap between ideas and action.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves, how can we take these AOP principles and actually use them to create tangible change in our communities and in the world? And that might look different depending on the context.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you're working in a school system, and you're trying to apply AOP principles to address racial disparities in discipline rates. You might start by conducting a critical assessment of the school's policies and practices to see how they might be contributing to these disparities.
So that's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier with that critical assessment of service users' experiences of oppression principle. You're looking at the systemic factors that might be at play.
Right, but then you need to go a step further and develop some concrete strategies for change. Maybe that means implementing restorative justice practices instead of just relying on punitive measures. Or maybe it means providing professional development for teachers to help them address their own implicit biases.
So it's about taking those theoretical principles and translating them into actionable steps.
Yeah.
They can create real change.
Exactly, and that's where the rubber meets the road with AOP. It's not enough to just understand the concepts. We have to be willing to roll up our sleeves,
Mm.
and do the work of putting them into practice.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm starting to see how AOP can be this powerful tool for creating a more just and equitable world.
Me too. And I think it's a journey that we all need to be on.
Well, I, for one, am excited to continue this journey, and I have a feeling there's still so much more to uncover.
Oh, there definitely is. We've explored a lot of ground, but there are still some important nuances and complexities to unpack.
That's what we'll be diving into next time, right?
Yeah, you got it. We'll be back to explore some of the limitations of AOP and discuss what it means to truly embody these principles in a way that is authentic and sustainable.
Welcome back. I'm still thinking about our last conversation about how AOP shows up in social movements. It's really inspiring to see how people are taking these ideas and making actual change happen.
Yeah, it is powerful, isn't it? But like any approach to social justice, I guess, AOP isn't perfect. It's got its complexities and limitations too. And those are important for us to think about.
For sure. We've talked about all the good stuff, all the positive aspects of AOP, but now I'm kind of curious about the other side of that. What are some of the criticisms of AOP? Or maybe some of the challenges?
Well, one that comes up a lot is that AOP can turn into just a buzzword, something that organizations or people say they support without really getting what it really means.
So it's like when someone says, they're all about diversity and inclusion, but then they don't change anything about how they hire people.
Exactly. It's way easier to talk the talk. Walking the walk means you're really committed to understanding power dynamics and challenging oppressive systems in ways that really mean something.
Right. And that goes back to what we talked about before about reflexivity, right? Always checking in with yourself and making sure what you're doing matches what you say you believe in.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't have that constant self-reflection, then AOP just becomes this label you slap on things.
Yeah.
And nothing really changes.
Are there other limitations that we should be thinking about?
Another critique you hear is that AOP can get stuck in just thinking about things theoretically without offering clear ways to actually do something. It's good to understand how oppression works, but how do we actually turn that into action?
I see what you mean. It can be super overwhelming to figure out where to even start when you're talking about these huge systemic problems.
Right. And that's where I think AOP could benefit from being more clear about the strategies and tools for actually putting these principles into practice.
So we got to go beyond just understanding the problem and start thinking about what the solutions might look like.
Exactly. And those solutions are going to be different depending on what you're trying to change.
That makes sense. You got to be flexible, right? You got to be adaptable. But you still want to stick to those core principles of AOP.
Exactly. And it's super important to remember that AOP isn't like a cookie cutter, something you can just use the same way everywhere. We got to be aware of how different cultures and communities might have different ways of approaching social justice.
So basically be respectful of different perspectives. And not act like there's only one right way to do things.
Right. AOP should be something that starts conversations and collaborations, not a bunch of rules that everyone has to follow the exact same way.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I understand AOP so much better now, the good parts and the tricky parts too. But before we go, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. We've talked about all this complex stuff, but how can you actually use these principles in your own life, even if you're not like a social worker or an activist?
That's a great question. I think the main thing to remember is that AOP isn't just for professionals. It's a way of living in the world that anyone can do. It's about noticing power dynamics, questioning your own biases, and trying to build relationships that are more fair in every part of your life.
So it's about weaving these principles into how you interact with people every day, at work, at home, just out and about.
Exactly. It all starts with that critical reflection on self, asking yourself those tough questions about how your actions affect other people, and then taking those answers and using them to make better choices. It's a journey. It's always evolving.
It's a journey that could lead to a world that's more just and more compassionate for everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into anti-oppressive practice. We hope you learned some stuff, thought about some new things, and maybe even feel a little bit inspired.
It's been great diving deep with you.
And remember, this is just the start of your exploration. Keep asking questions. Keep questioning everything. And keep working to build a world where everyone can thrive.